Hello everybody and welcome to this Key Stage 3 Science video, and in this video we're going to take a review of some Key Stage 3 biology questions focusing on respiration, interdependence, so that's food chains and things, and reproduction. And if you haven't seen these questions before, pause it before I go through my review and you'll be able to see the whole question on screen before I start modelling my answers. And on the subject of modelling my answers, I will be using my thoughts as well as actually just what the answers are, and I'll write my thoughts in blue and the answers itself, so the things that will get you your marks, they will be in green. So without further ado, let's begin. Now this whole question is about respiration in fact, but they introduce it with a question about dancing and movement and muscles. And so an important word here, this is Nancy and she's moving her arms and legs as she dances using pairs of antagonistic muscles. Now antagonistic muscles are like your bicep and your tricep. And so here is her bicep, and when that contracts, her arm will move this way. And what will happen is the muscle will sort of bunch up and thicken, and that's what you see in the sort of the cartoon muscles that have contracted and somebody's flexing their muscles. And then if she wants to move her arm the other way, I'll switch my colours just this time. If she wants to move her arm this way, then this is the muscle that will contract the tricep. And it's the same idea with the legs as well. When one muscle contracts, the other one relaxes. And so any movements, they will always be in pairs. And that's because muscles can only pull things when they contract. And so they have pairs, and one muscle contracts to pull something one way, and the other contracts to pull it the other way. And so the answer here is the third one. As one muscle contracts, the other relaxes. This part of the question focuses on Nancy's breathing, and it says that her breathing changes because she needs more oxygen. And the graph below shows how the volume of air in her lungs changes when she dances. So we've got time on the x-axis, so this is the longer that she's dancing, and then we've got the volume of air in Nancy's lungs. And you can see that the volume is going up and down as she's breathing in and out. And you can also see, by the way, that the volume of air in Nancy's lungs never goes to zero. So even when she exhales, which is on the way down here, she doesn't breathe out all the air in her lungs. Now let's move on to the question. The question says, from the graph, give 2 ways that her breathing changes when she dances. So there's quite a few different ways. First of all, we notice that this graph goes more extreme. It goes larger up here, which means she's breathing in more air. So I would start with that one, is that she gets more air, or oxygen is probably better, but it's not only oxygen that she's breathing in, it's nitrogen as well. So she gets more air or she gets more oxygen. Those are both fine. Or you could just say that she's taken in a greater volume of air, or she's breathing more air out. Now also, I don't know if you noticed this, but at the beginning, the peaks and the troughs, they're further apart, and what that means is she's breathing more slowly, whereas when we get over here the peaks are a lot more bunched up, and that means that her breathing is getting faster, and that's what I would put next, that her breathing gets faster, or breathing speeds up, or she takes more breaths or something like that. So that would be something that I would say. Now you could also say that her breathing gets deeper, or she takes bigger breaths or something like that. So I'm going to put an extra option on here. So you don't have to write this one because it did say only 2, but you might have put this as one of your answers, and I want you to know that that is okay. Now the final question says that Nancy's muscle cells produce carbon dioxide as she dances, and your body has to get rid of that carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide's not good for your body to keep inside it. It will feel really weird, and you'd feel faint if you didn't get rid of your carbon dioxide. So which of the following shows how the carbon dioxide is removed from Nancy's body? Now notice they all end in nose, so she's breathing out through her nose, so we don't need to look there. And they all begin with the muscle cells that have made the carbon dioxide as they've respired. And so the big question mark is, where do we go from here? So the muscle cells produce the carbon dioxide and it goes on a journey. It has to go into the blood. So it can't go straight from the muscles to the windpipe. So it must go into the blood. And then from the blood, it needs to get out, and the kind of the gateway, if you like, to getting in and out of the blood is the lungs. So the lungs would be next. And so, in fact, we know the right answer already now, because lungs being next, well, we've already ruled out this second one down. So it must be the third one, because it can't go from the blood into your windpipe and then back into the lungs. That one doesn't make sense there, because the lungs has got to be before the windpipe, because your windpipe is what connects your lungs to your mouth and your nose. And so the correct answer has got to be the third one down. Okay, this question is about populations and the interdependence of different forms of the same moth, the speckled moth or the black moth. And then we begin with a graph. The graph below shows how the percentage of speckled moths changed between 1950 and 2000 in one city. And so we are looking at the speckled moth population here, and that is this line. And that's all been completed for us, and we can see that as time goes by, that's the x-axis here, as time goes by, broadly speaking, the percentage of speckled moths, because that's what the y-axis is, the percentage of speckled moths is increasing, but it isn't increasing regularly. At first, it isn't even increasing at all. It's pretty much flat and a stable population in this first region here. And then at the end, it looks like we've reached a stable population as well. And the biggest increase is in this middle section here. So they've begun the black moth track as well. So the black moth is starting at 90, and it looks like it's starting to take a dip here. So the question says, complete the table with the missing year and the percentage using the graph. So if I just change my colour to red, just so we can track on here some important facts. So we need to work out what year this is, where it is 50% speckled moths and 50% black moths. Now, we don't have any data on the black moth when it's 50%, but we do know that 50% is in this middle line on here. And so 50% is tracking down to here. That's between 1980 and 1990, exactly halfway between, and so that means it's going to be 1985. Now, the second part looks like it would be tricky to do, because it looks like you've got to use your graph to work out what the percentage of black moths should be. But if you notice the third column in this table, total percentage is 100. We actually don't need to use the graph for this one, because if the total percentage is 100 and we've got 78% speckled moths, well then we need to do 100 minus 78 to get the answer, and that gives us a percentage of 22% of black moths. And then the second part for this question says, the percentage of black moths from 1950 to 1980 is also shown on the graph. Continue the line, that's our command, on the graph to show how the percentage of black moths changed between 1980 and the year 2000. And so we need to drop it down to sort of like mirror what's happening to the speckled moths on the way up. So for instance, when it is 50 and for the speckled moths, it will be 50 for the black moths. And so we need to pass through this point on here. That's from the table, 50-50. And then in 1990, it's 78 to 22. So that means that that needs to be about here. And then in the year 1995 to 2000, where I said it was stable towards the end, well, then it needs to be correspondingly stable for the black at not 90%, which is what it is up here for the speckled moths. It needs to be at 10% for the black moths. And now we've got our general kind of like positions. It's just a case of using a nice smooth curve to connect those points together. And so that will get us our 2 marks on here. There'll be 1 mark probably for this bit passing through the middle at 50-50, so it's important that we've plotted that point from the table. There'll be 1 mark there, and then there'll be 1 mark for the line levelling off at 10%. and this middle bit doesn't need to be quite exactly like mine, but the general idea is it must pass through 50-50 and then it must finish at 10 for the black moths and 90 for the speckled moths. Now, this question is still connected to the main one, but they're showing the data in a totally different way. This is still about black moths and speckled moths, and it's still adding up to a total of 100%. And if all the moths in one particular part of the country were black moths, it would look like this. And if all the black moths were gone and it was speckled moths, it would look like a white circle. And then if we have a look at this, just one example at the right hand side, where it is half white and half black, that means it's 50% black moths and 50% speckled moths. So we've got two maps of England and Wales. In 1956, this is where we found the moths, and this is their sort of distribution percentage. So you can see that we've got them in all sorts of different places, south coast, east coast, etc. And then in 1996, we're still measuring them in the same place, but the circles have changed, whether they're shaded in black a lot or whether they're shaded in black a little bit. So the question says, how did the percentage of black moths change at place A? So place A is this one that is here. And at the beginning, it is 100% black moths. And in 1996, it's about 25% black moths, I'd say. That black wedge is about a quarter. And so it's only one mark here. So I think we're okay to just say that it decreased. And we can really show off, if it was worth 2 marks, we'd definitely do this. It decreased, I think, by about 75%. Alternatively, what you could say is that in 1956, there were more black moths, or there was a greater percentage of black moths than in 1996. And then the final question is asking us to give one way that the graph is better than the maps, and then one way that the maps is better than the graphs. And so, first of all, the graphs, I don't know if you remember, but there were 3 rows for the graphs because the graph shows more years. And so we probably don't even need to use the word graph because they've asked us why the graph is better, but we'll just say the graph shows more years. So we can get a bigger idea of how the percentages have changed over time. It's also, I mean, we don't need to keep going, but it's also easier to read, I think, the graph. You have to use a bit more brain power to work out what these kind of pie charts are meaning. And it looks more precise as well on the graph, again, because you can see the percentages. And now the maps are better because they show different locations on where we find these different populations of moths, or you could say it covers a wider area, or it gives geographical detail. All 3 of these are possible answers, but we only need one. This third question is looking at food webs, and food webs show the complicated interconnected feeding relationships in a particular habitat or an ecosystem. And it starts with the producers at the bottom, and it shows the direction of energy transfer and biomass transfer. So the grasses transfer their energy to the rabbits. That's what this arrow is showing. Now, in some ways we can think of it as what eats what, but it is much better to show that it's the energy moving through the food web. Now the question, one year the snail population is increased in grassland areas. So let's just write a little upwards arrow for the snails. So snail population is increasing. How could an increase in the number of snails cause the caterpillar population to increase? Now, this doesn't feel obvious at first, but if you think about what affects the caterpillar population, so the caterpillar population is affected by what eats the caterpillar. Now, the thing that eats the caterpillar is also the thing that eats snails. And so, if there are more snails, there are going to be more snails eaten by the blackbirds. And if there are more snails eaten by the blackbirds won't eat so many caterpillars. And so that's what you should say, or you could say blackbirds eat snails instead of caterpillars. And the follow-up question, snail poison can be used to control the number of snails. After some time, each owl contains more poison than each snail. Explain why each owl contains more poison than each snail. Well, every time the blackbird eats the snail, the poison gets passed from the snail to the blackbird, and then the owls eat the blackbirds. And so the blackbirds will have a buildup of poison inside them, and then the owls will eat the blackbirds. But for this question, it is okay to say blackbirds eat the snails, owls eat blackbirds, and then the poison becomes more concentrated. Because if each snail had one piece of poison in it and a blackbird eats 10 snails, well, the blackbird's got 10 pieces of poison in it. And if the owl eats 2 blackbirds, it's got 20 pieces of poison in it. And so this is called bioaccumulation. It means the build-up of substances at different stages in a food chain. And then the last part of the question on this page, a scientist wants to record the number of dandelion plants in a grassland area. Describe how they could use a 1 metre squared quadrat to estimate the number of dandelions growing in a grassy area. So the quadrat is a piece of metal, a wire frame that is 1 metre on one side and 1 metre on the other side, and that gives a total area of 1 square metre. And so what you would do is you would throw the quadrat randomly and count the number of dandelions that you find inside that quadrat. And then you would repeat by moving the quadrat around, again randomly, and you'd find an average for how many dandelions there were in a quadrat, and then what you would do is you would scale it up to find out how many quadrats would fit inside your area. And that's easy enough to do because it's a 1 metre square quadrat. And so, for instance, if the total grassland area was 100 metres squared, all we would do is multiply our average per quadrat by 100, and that would give us our total population. Now, in terms of getting these marks, it is only 2 marks, and I've mentioned 3 points. So I think that you would need to get 1 of the first 2. You don't need both of those to get the tick, and then you do need to include that 3rd point to get the 2nd tick. So I think that's how you get your 2 marks. 1 of the first 2, and then the 3rd one. This next question is about pyramids of numbers. And so we've been given populations of different organisms, dandelions, foxes and rabbits, and we've been told how many there are in this particular area. And we've been asked, here is our command, to complete the pyramid of numbers on the graph paper below to represent this food chain. Label the pyramid to show each animal. So we've been given 2 commands, to complete it and to label it. So first of all, we've got the dandelion, and the dandelion is worth 200, and it's definitely worth counting the number of squares here to make sure we get our scale correct. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. So the dandelions take up 20 squares, and the dandelions is 200. So if 20 squares is 200, 1 square equals 10. And by 1 square, I mean a square that is this size. So actually 1 square is 10, and that 1 square is 5 little squares. And so 5 little squares equals 10, so 1 little square equals 2. So now we've decided on our scale. We need to do rabbits next, and rabbits is 20, and 20 was, 10 was 1 big square, and so that means that 20 is going to be 2 big squares, and so that's going to be my rabbit area here. So 2 big squares wide, and I'll just shade it in so you can see exactly where I've put it. And we need to label it, and so I'm going to label that rabbits. Foxes is trickier because foxes is 4. 4 is obviously not 1 big square, it's only worth 2 per little square. So the foxes is going to be a really skinny little square on here, which I will shade in a different colour. I know I said green gets you the marks, but I'll shade it in red just so you can see it there. It's going to be 2 little squares wide. So I'll write on the side the key. So the rabbits is 2 big squares, or if you were thinking in little squares, it was 10 little. And the foxes is only going to be 2 little squares. And that's all you need to do for the 2 marks. It needs to be labelled and it needs to be the right scale. This final question is about reproduction, but it begins with a question about competition. It says we've got a lion in a zoo and its lifespan is 22 years, whereas a lion in the wild has got a lifespan of 17 years. And then the question is, suggest 2 reasons why. And there's probably 4 reasons why. And the first 3 are all to do with the crucial things that organisms are competing for in the wild. And so food, for instance. So there is less competition for food in a zoo. There is plenty of food or water. They get fed, they get a balanced diet in a zoo. They have all the shelter that they need and they're protected from bad weather. And they have access to medical treatment if they get hurt. And they're also less likely to be injured or killed because there isn't any hunting of lions because they're in a zoo. Now the question continues by looking at different mammals and their different lengths of pregnancy in days compared to their average lifespan in years. And we've got 5 animals that we're looking at. And he's plotted the data from the table in a graph where average length of pregnancy goes along the x-axis and the average lifespan is going up on the y-axis. Using the points John plotted, draw a line of best fit. Now this does look like it should be a perfect straight line, I think, on here. So what I've drawn in green there, I think is probably the best thing to do. I don't really think there is scope for it being a curved, but if it's a curved line that just about matches that, then I think we're okay. The next question says, from the graph, describe the relationship between the average length of pregnancy and the average lifespan. And so what we can say without any doubt is as we go to the right on the graph, so average length of pregnancy goes up, the average lifespan definitely also goes up. So you can say animals with longer pregnancies live longer, or the shorter the pregnancy, the shorter the lifespan. So you're coming at that from either of those 2 different angles. This final question is building on what we've just done. And it says John's found some data about 3 other mammals, and here they are here, human, horse and giraffe. The average length of pregnancy is shown here, and the average lifespan is here in years. And we've been commanded to plot the 3 points on the graph. And so we've only got 2 marks here. So that means that if you plot 2 correctly, you get 1 tick, and for the 3rd one, you get the 2nd tick. So you need to have all 3 correct to get the ticks. Now I'm actually going to do this in red again, just so we can see my points clearly against the background. So the human's average length of pregnancy is 266 days. So 250 and 300. Each little square is going to be worth 10 because there's 5 little squares. So that means that's 250, 260, and so it's going to be halfway between the 2. So that means that humans are going to fit here on the x-axis, but all the way up at 72 on the y-axis. Now 72 is here, and that's because we've got 5 little squares and we're going up by 10, so 72, 74, 76, 78. So humans are up here, not on the line. And then the horse is 340 days, and so 340 days is here for the horse. So I'll just do an H for the human, HU for human. Horse is 340, and it's 25 years for its average lifespan. And so that's the horse. And then last of all, the giraffe is 440, so that's right, it's basically off the scale, nearly, certainly off my line that I drew, and its average lifespan is 17 years, so 10, 12, 14, 16, 17 takes it to here for the giraffe. And you can be accurate within a half a square on here, there's a little bit of tolerance. And so the question says, do these points fit the relationship described in the previous question? And the answer is definitely no, because they're nowhere near my line, and the humans has got the shortest length of pregnancy, but the longest lifespan out of the 3 that we've just plotted. So the data is much more scattered. There doesn't seem to be a connection for those 3. The giraffes have got the longest length of pregnancy, but actually the shortest lifespan. And so they actually show the exact opposite piece of data, don't they? They show that for these 3 particular, the human, the horse and the giraffe, it looks like the longer the length of pregnancy, the shorter the lifespan. So if we were to just plot a best fit line for those 3 points, it would look something like that. And so they're definitely contradicting each other. And you only need to say one of those things for that mark, though, just to be clear. I know I've listed a few here, but you don't need to say all of them at all. Okay, that's the end of the questions. That's the end of this video. Hope it's been useful. I'll see you again soon.